Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of The Kevin Moore Show. Now, just a quick mention of my sponsor, Keen. They are a trusted network of talented spiritual advisors who are dedicated to empowering lives by helping people discover answers to the most pressing questions, gain closure, find their purpose in life, and much more. Now, Keen is giving the Kevin Moore Show listeners the first 10-minute readings for only $1.99. Now, to get your first 10-minute reading with my sponsor, Keen, just go to trykeen.com/Kevin or go to the description below. Now, on today's show, I'm joined with my guest, Sylvia True, who will discuss her novel, Where Madness Lies. Now, this is a story about hope and redemption, about what we pass on, both genetically and culturally. It's about the high price of repression and how one woman who nearly lost everything must be willing to reveal the failures of the past in order to save future generation. Where Madness Lies is based on a true story of the author's own family. So, Sylvia True, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, Sylvia, this is going to be an interview based around your book, which is called Where Madness Lies. What was the reason behind that title for that book to begin with?
Well, it's about, primarily, I would say, it's about many things, but it is about mental illness. So madness in that respect, but it's also about the madness of the Nazis and the laws that were instituted in 1934, and also a little bit about the madness of what goes on in mental hospitals, which isn't always due to the patients. So you can interpret the title, I think, in a number of different ways. And the other way is also the main character in the book, who's based off of my grandmother, repressed a lot of her past because it was traumatic, for understandable reasons. And there's a certain madness in that too. So there's a lot of madnesses that apply.
Right, absolutely. So this is historical fiction, yeah, based on two women, and is it one with mental health issues?
Well, in the book, there are actually two women who have mental health issues, one in the 1930s in Germany and one in 1984 in the US. And it's partly the story of how those two women connect, and mostly the story about the woman Inga, who tries to take care of her sister in Nazi Germany in around 1934, and things don't work out so well, and then has an opportunity to help another family member who's mentally ill in 1984, which is her granddaughter. And in helping her granddaughter, she really has to reflect on the past and revisit some of the painful things that happened to her and really grow from them.
Right. So obviously this is based on your own family background, which you've put into this historical fiction. Yes. So with your own family background then, you were brought up in which country?
So I was born in England, but I don't sound like you, unfortunately. I sound much more American. We moved to this country. My family moved to this country when I was about 5. We moved to Chicago, the Midwest. My father was a theoretical nuclear physicist, and he had a sabbatical at a national lab. We ended up staying here, although we moved back and forth for a number of different reasons, different years. And so I just had like this, what was the question again? Oh, based on where is my family based from? So it's complicated. Anyway, both my parents were born in Germany, in Frankfurt, actually, and they were not far from each other distance-wise in that country. They both fled. My mother's family fled to Switzerland, and my father's family fled to England. My mother met my father later in England. She was Swiss national champion skater and was training there. They married, had children, and then we were all moved to the U.S.
Okay, so in your parents' life then, would you say there was a lot of madness in some sense?
Yes, absolutely. Um, a lot of it was based on repression. Some of the things that happened to my father before he left Germany. Um, and I think that for the mostly though, I think for my parents, the trauma came from the trauma that had come before them from the Nazi era and mostly from their parents. And then a lot of repression in which, and it's very common, in which they weren't really allowed to speak of things and they had to be, perfect, mentally, physically perfect. That was, something that came out of that whole time. Even though they were Jewish, it was still, we have to be perfect, otherwise we won't survive. And that leads to a lot of
Yes.
madness in
So
life.
they left Germany just before the start of the war to Switzerland.
Yes.
Right.
What mother's family, Switzerland, father's family, England.
Right. Yes, that's why I'm getting confused. Yes, so it was your
Yeah, it's confusing.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So your father was English and your mother was German.
Swiss. Well, they were both German. Both sides fled.
Oh, I'm getting
One
confused.
side to England,
Oh, right.
one to Switzerland.
Okay, got you. So right. So they're both yeah, that's why I got confused. So they're both German, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yes.
yeah, one to Switzerland, one to the UK, but eventually both meeting in the UK. Um
And right.
and this they fled just before the start of the Second World War.
Correct.
Okay, so the premises of this is that what you're saying here is that the past issues that our family members have, that is also carried on to the future generations as well.
Absolutely. And so I think mostly it's carried on in a certain fear and a certain shame. And I would say, although shame was pretty prevalent in my life, I would say fear is the number one way it's carried on, especially repressed fear. You're not allowed to show you're frightened. You're not allowed to show you're anxious. You're not allowed to really show who you really are. There's a certain desire to keep hiding. And with that comes all sorts of things. People feel like they're basically a fraud, or that anxiety turns inward and turns more to depression. So, yeah, I think those are some of the effects of what happens. I mean, I think that happens not, okay, it happened in my family in a sort of a dramatic way, obviously. But even as I've talked about this story over the years and shared it with many people, I mean, I think secrets in families, and there are all kinds of secrets. I mean, whether it's alcoholism or, all a variety of different things, those secrets are felt by children, um, even if they're not told. And that creates a certain amount of fear and shame. And that is carried on.
Yes. So going back to um, grandmother and well father as well, and and your mum in that time in Germany as a Jew, um, well even in Switzerland actually after the war, I guess, was there must have been a lot of pain that they were experiencing for what their fellow Jews had to go through, um, the atrocities that were committed on them as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with my grandmother, though, I feel like in many ways she had a particularly hard time when after she fled to Switzerland, because she lost everything. And she lost her status in society. She left her husband there. He was the one person in the family who wasn't Jewish, and he stayed as a university professor. And because of the Nuremberg laws, she wasn't allowed to stay married to him. And I think the biggest loss was her sister, who was the other character who was mentally ill in the book. And I think that depth of trauma and pain, um, in order for her to survive, I think she repressed a lot of that pain and ended up becoming quite a rigid, controlling person, because she couldn't control all those horrors that happened to her in her life there in Germany. She then tried to control it in different ways. You know, for instance, every single clock in her house had to go off at the exact same time, like every day. And I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be a great thing. But I think that what happens in this book is through the mental illness of the next generation, um, and her wanting to help with that, she then has to deal with some of the traumas of the past and some of her obsessiveness and controlling, and has to kind of open up and, deal with those hard times.
Yeah, because obviously during World War II and after, there were still extreme attitudes, weren't there, towards certain things. Um, yeah, towards ideas. Um, yeah, I can imagine. Alcohol was a way to turn to some of that as well. Alcoholic parents.
Right. I think that it's interesting that you say. I mean, my parents didn't choose alcohol. It's interesting what they chose to sort of survive. I think people have different things. My mother was a champion skater in Switzerland. She was Swiss national champion, and the way she really coped was through physical exercise and competition, and that helped her. My father was a theoretical nuclear physicist, so he went completely to the intellectual. Not emotional things were never discussed. I mean, the emotions came out of him in kind of crazy, weird ways. He yelled all the time. I don't even know if he knows what he yelled about, the curtains not being closed properly or something, absurd. But he tried to keep those emotions down, and of course they came out in the home in not always pleasant ways. So I think people have interesting ways of coping with different traumas that they've had in their lives.
Right. And who was the family member that was euthanized? What was the connection there?
So that was my grandmother's sister, and she was diagnosed in 1930s, a little bit before, with mental illness. Although what her mental illness was is certainly not clear. She eventually landed with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But in Germany at that time, many people were given that diagnosis. And, her diagnosis started out as hysteria, depression. And like many people, she didn't get better. And so she landed with schizophrenia, which at that time was really a dangerous diagnosis. And in 1933, they enacted the sterilization law. And in Germany, from 1934 to 1939, over 400,000 people were sterilized. And so that was done by, a health court and doctors saying, yeah, this person shouldn't reproduce, because, I mean, there was this huge belief in eugenics throughout the world, not just in Germany. And in fact, in America, it was even bigger at one point than in Germany. But of course, the Germans took it to, or I should say the Nazis, took it to really an obscene end. And that eventually it ended up in the murder of mental patients.
Yeah, is that what happened to her? She was murdered.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, that was the program. It was a euthanasia program. And actually, it was, in many ways, it was really the Nazis' sort of opening act, right? So in these sanatoriums, they perfected their techniques for gassing and for burning, crematoriums, and for pillaging the corpses. All of that was done before they then, built the gas chambers and the concentration camps. So what happened to the mentally ill was truly the opening act.
Yeah, I've never heard it described like that before, as though, that they had that sort of test run, as sick as it is,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
I mean, the doctors were the ones who, I mean, I'm not, I hate to make all people sound evil. That's never what I want. But I mean, it was the doctors who came up with these gas chambers in the mental hospitals. And it was the same doctors who then built them in the concentration camps.
Do you have pictures of her?
Of Rigmore?
Yeah,
Yes, I do.
yeah, yeah. Wait,
Actually,
yeah.
can you see behind me at all?
A little bit, yes.
I mean, I don't. I can. So there's one picture. This one, I'm going to take it off of my wall. Probably break my computer because I'm really good at that. So this is. I don't know what you can see. Yeah, but this is one of those, I guess, etchings. I'm not sure what you call these. It's gorgeous. Anyway, this was when she was a child. Rigmore was a beautiful woman. She was very talented too, in art and music.
How old was she when they ended her life? How old was she then?
She was 26.
Jesus Christ! Wow. Do you think she knew what was happening to her?
Yeah, of course.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yes, absolutely.
How was her life ended? If you don't mind saying that, was it?
So her life was basically. So in her case, I guess in some ways she was. I don't know. To say this is fortunate is just the wrong word, but I'm just going to leave it at that. Because of my grandmother and because they tried to do everything they could, and when that was clear they couldn't, they actually had a doctor give her a shot that killed her, which was all right, better than a gas chamber.
Was that talked about in the family ever much?
No. So here's what happened, and sort of the connection in the book. No, it wasn't at all. It was a huge secret, right? And what wasn't a huge secret was that we had to never show signs of any weakness emotionally, right? Never. So as it happened, I wasn't emotionally weak, but I was a very sensitive child. And I was also prone to depression, but of course I didn't know that then at all. I did know that, I was told to pull up my socks and get a grip or whatever. And then it was after I had my first child, I had a postpartum depression combined with a depression that I had all my life that was probably very similar to what Rigmore had. And I ended up in a mental hospital here in Massachusetts, McLean, which is a renowned hospital. And it was actually, the best education of my life. And I do consider myself very fortunate. And when I ended up in a mental hospital, my mother and grandmother, they were terrified. I don't think they necessarily thought that was equated with death, but it was very frightening. And it took a while for them to maybe come to terms with it, but they did. And it was through my hospitalization that they eventually opened up about what happened in the past. And I think what happened was my grandmother and I then could really finally become close. I mean, she had been, she was all about rules and rigidity, and you have to do it this way and sit that way and hold your fork this way. And in her helping me, she had to expose herself and open up. And I also had to listen and open up to her and realize that all of her rules and her need to control came from a very traumatic past. And I think, without sounding too cheesy, if I can say that, what I would hope the reader could really understand from this book is that you have to really listen to each other, truly listen to each other, and have empathy for wherever the person is coming from, and understanding not just for yourself, but for the other person. And with that understanding and the openness, they could finally connect. And that's when you can finally have love too. So
Powerful, right? Powerful. So,
yeah.
did your grandma eventually come to the US, or was she still in Switzerland? Where she was?
No,
No.
she stayed in Switzerland.
So you went over to see her?
I went over all the time to see
Mm.
her. She did come over when I was in McLean. She came over quite a bit, actually. But yes, I spent a lot of time in Switzerland.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place, isn't it, Switzerland?
No, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and obviously, when did she pass?
In around 80, 86 ish.
Okay, so some time ago. So you had the conversation with her, as you've just discussed there, prior to her passing. Do you think that was really healing for her to have had that sort of conversation?
Yes, yes, I
Mm,
do.
mm. So how have being aware of what you're aware now, and this whole intergenerational things, how, and I mean, this is quite an extreme way, to transfer patterns across with what you guys had to go through, and it's an amazing story. But this could be done in all sorts of different ways. How do you stop? How have you worked on them passing over any issues that you had over to the next generation then, or is that impossible to do?
I'm just thinking of my daughters right now who would be like, oh, mommy, please shut up. No. So, oh, no, but it's interesting because I think that's like such a fabulous question, right? Now, I do think I've succeeded in not completely. I mean, we try our best as mothers. I mean, my mother tried her best. My grandmother tried her best. This was the best. I do believe mothers try their best. It's not perfect by any means, and we actually don't want it to be. But with my daughters, I mean, I was very obviously open about feelings and feeling anxious and feeling depressed. And I think they both inherited aspects of that. One of my daughters leans more toward the anxiety side, the other towards the depression side. And I think that is somewhat genetic. I mean, I see it throughout my family. And I mean, the biggest thing that I wanted them to know was that there's help out there and that you don't have to be ashamed of it. And they're not. I mean, they're really not. They're, you know, they see therapists like, somebody would go to the dentist. They don't think twice about it. In my family, that was a huge shameful step for me to be in a mental hospital, and then for me to seek and continue seeking therapy. That was something that before that wasn't allowed, and now it is allowed and it's accepted, not just, in my siblings' families as well. So we sort of, we've kind of walked into the light when I walked into McLean in a sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And have you visited Germany?
I haven't. I did when I was younger, a girl. But no, I haven't. No, I mean, I visited. I tend to visit places where I have family, or I go to the jungle in Peru. I take students to do research there, so that's a whole nother different side. But I've gone. I've spent quite a bit of time in Europe, mostly England, actually.
I guess we go through generational issues when we pass things on, but then I guess that the whole country of Germany has that nationwide sort of issue to deal with, don't they? That for their past and what their forefathers did.
Well, and right. I mean, and we have different history and different issues in this country, right? Like that.
Yeah.
look at what our and
How do we stop passing it on? Yeah, yeah. How do we forgive
yeah,
ourselves?
right, right. And how to, and I guess again, I mean, it's a matter of having the conversations and having empathy and understanding. I think that's how we forgive ourselves. When you look at what we're going through right now in this country and how divided we've become, and it just, it's horrible. But I really think the way through it is to have really open conversations with each other, especially people who are on different sides. And I know we feel like right now there are just two sides, and there are more than two sides, and we really have to listen and stop blaming. I mean, it's so easy just to blame and be angry, and it's much harder to listen to people's stories and try to understand where they're coming from. And I think that's in the end, the main point of the book is that both the character, the granddaughter and the grandmother, have to really understand where the other one is coming from. And with that acceptance, of course, then there's an openness and a love that can be felt. So in the end, there's hope. It's sort of a book that goes from rather dark to light, I hope.
Were you able to become a more of a friend to yourself after you when you were getting better from the mental breakdown that you had? You were able to sort of self-reflect more.
Well, yes. Although I love the way you termed that. Was I able to become more of a friend to myself? That has been a lifelong journey of work for me. I think that I've learned it mostly through relationships with other people, and especially with my students. I'm not quote unquote friends with my students, but I'm a chemistry teacher, and I also want my students to understand the importance of a certain openness and an ability to reflect and to make mistakes, and to be like, that's fine. That's the only way to learn. I mean, I don't know how many times, probably a day, I say, like, yeah, you can't learn it unless you make a mistake. So, in that way, I suppose I have become much gentler with myself. And that's probably been the hardest battle.
Yes, yeah. I think a lot of people go through the same thing. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
in different ways, whether it be drug abuse
Right,
or whatever abuse it is.
right.
Do you know what I mean? To get through the other end of that, and to see that light at the end of the tunnel. Um, yeah,
And the shame we feel for things that obviously, like, you, somebody might feel, ashamed because they got the wrong meat at the grocery store. I mean, I don't know, whatever. But, and we'd be like, that's ridiculous. Why feel ashamed? But then what we feel ashamed about is equally ridiculous from somebody else's perspective. So, I
yes,
think,
yes. It could be a family member that's done something that you're just trying to get to terms with whatever it is they've done. Do you know what I mean? But
right.
um, I think everything's a lesson, though, isn't it? Everything's a teaching. Do you see that with what you went through? That this was part of your, you know, part of something you needed to learn.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, I don't know if I said this earlier, but I can repeat it. I mean, for me, going into a mental hospital was the biggest lesson I ever learned. It was incredible what I learned there. And I think, if we look at many of us, when we reflect on our lives, our greatest obstacles are often our greatest lessons, right? And I think that was absolutely true for me. And then post McLean, there were, I sort of became free in a way to, I felt this sense of freedom to live life differently, and not feel so burdened by the shame and the guilt that I had carried around. Um, I started, I actually started learning so many other things about spirituality, and, I started on a whole new path, which was really
L-
fun and amazing too.
let's just get into that just very briefly. But just before we do, just going back to one last story in your family, because I'm sure there's so many. Um, your grandfather was the doctor of the Anne Frank family. Is that right?
Yes, my grandfather on my father's side um, was a doctor of the Frank family before they fled to Amsterdam. And my grandfather, he was, I remember him well. He was really this beautiful, kind, sensitive man who absolutely did not believe, um, that what was going to happen was going to happen. And he really literally had to get forced to go on a train to get out of there because he didn't believe that these terrible things would happen. And, it's scary because I don't know. They do happen. It's scary.
It is. And did he ever share with you personally? Were you just too young to have known him
I
much?
was pretty young, but he shared in a different way. Like I know this is odd, but I mean, he took us to the sound of music over and over again. That like moved him so deeply. You know, so yeah, the one thing they did not share, neither my father or my grandfather, and it took my mother and grandmother many years. They didn't share some of the traumatic things or more difficult things that happened to them, which is very common.
In the sense of, obviously this was all prior to the war, or was it what even in the war as well?
Well, I would say prior, what happened in Germany with some of the abuse my father underwent in school because he was Jewish and he wore glasses, and he was bullied and beaten and all of that. I learned about that a little bit from my mother, but again, these things were kept tightly locked, and I think that, not to say, I mean, we shouldn't go around like, you want to hear about the abuse I had? No, we shouldn't go around doing that either. But to keep it all so locked up and repressed also is problematic. And
I've never been. I mean, obviously, I used to live just outside of Amsterdam, but I
oh, you
never.
did.
Yeah, I never. I just in a place called Almere, but I never actually got a chance to go to the Anne Frank museum. I mean, I will be going back to Holland at some point, and I must do that. Um, yeah, because that's, well, when things go back to normal, right? But
Right.
yeah.
I know.
Have you ever been to Holland or?
No, I have
Well,
not.
I'm sure one day if you get a chance, you will go to the Anne
Yeah.
Frank Museum, and just to know that you've got a connection there, with a family member that knew him, which is pretty cool.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so moving to the spiritual side, just for the last part of this interview as well, what drove you? Were you actually was there any sort of religion in that was practiced majorly in the family? Why and if did you go to spirituality from any religion?
So religion was again sort of not allowed in the family, although weirdly, my mother would drop us off, me and my sibs, at this Lutheran church. She wouldn't go in because she was Jewish and she didn't believe in Christ, but she wasn't, she wanted us to be able to pass, basically. We still grew up in that crazy place where it's like, if you're with Jewish people, you can be Jewish, but if you're with Christians, you better be Christian. So the religion, the actual religious beliefs, I was lost. I didn't really have any because I knew that we were being dropped off in front of a church and my mother wouldn't go in. I mean, so it was all a bit odd. And my father was a strong atheist, right? And it was after I got out of McLean, I met someone who introduced me to this woman called Sophie, who was a psychic. And I was like, yeah, that's BS. I mean, those things do not exist, blah, blah, blah. But as I listened to a few stories, of course, I became curious and intrigued because who would it be, right? And so I eventually said, all right, I'm going to go and see her. And I remember my first reading was over 30 years ago with her, and she sadly died about a year ago. She was older, she was 91, but she was my mentor, guide, whatever, for 30 years. And it was just amazing to have her in my life. But I remember my first reading and I was so struck by it because I was like, wait a second, how could she know this? And, there were things I hadn't told my friend that there was no way she could have known. And then over the years, I, I mean, she had readings with such specificity that was just, it was mind blowing to me. And she didn't read tarot cards. She read like a regular pack of cards, which regular cards were originally designed for readings. I mean, I know people think they're playing cards and they call them playing cards, but originally that's what they were made for. They were made so people could read your future or whatever. And through a number of readings with her, then, especially around the time my mother was dying, she told me my mother would have visitors, have my grandmother, my grandfather come and visit. And I thought that was crazy. Now, for some reason, I had decided, this was a number of years ago, I had decided, well, psychics exist, okay? But mediums know that's going too far. I mean, I don't know why I had that like weird delineation in my head. But then I obviously opened up to mediums and then just started doing more and more research. I mean, my daughters call me the medium hunter. And it's been a really fabulous journey, though, because it's just opened up my mind and I guess my heart in so many ways. And it's funny because even last night I was with my grandchildren, and Finn, who's 4, was talking to his nursery school teacher the other day about how his grandfather, who died, still watches him all the time. Now, he got, his grandfather didn't die, it was his great grandfather. He was a little confused, but the school was like, wait, what's he talking about? So it's really wonderful. I mean, that I am actually getting to teach after this crazy history that I had, of the Nazis and, atheism, that I'm getting to teach my grandchildren something about spirituality, and that, my daughter wants them to understand this. I mean, my daughter's come with me to see a number of mediums and psychics. And so it's been a great journey. And I actually was able to teach it also in my school. I'm the head of the science department, science and technology department, which we renamed the Science, Technology, and Paranormal Studies department, because my colleagues and I, mostly, it was my curiosity, but, I brought some of them in and we really worked on it. I mean, the University of Virginia has just unbelievable people there. And Jim Tucker does this. I don't know if you've seen him. I mean, so when you start like really looking at these things and you see the mountains of data they have collected on past lives in other countries and, all kinds of things, it's fascinating. And we're sort of closed off, I think, in the West. I mean, even in Peru, it's so, people's beliefs and spirituality, and, you can claim, for example, like say you feel someone in your family got sick and you believe it was a curse put on your family by another family. If you claim that, the police will actually investigate it. And people here think that's so crazy and ridiculous. But, lots of different societies and cultures have different beliefs. And I think we're kind of closed off to many of them. Anyway, that was a long answer.
No, that's great. I mean, wow. So, I mean, for you then, even though you've got one foot in the scientific world, which is, I think,
right.
which is so important, you've also got this other foot in the sort of, spiritual, or if you want to call it paranormal,
right.
or alternative.
Right.
Well, yeah. But you are a firm believer that that this isn't over when we die. That it's
right.
just another journey.
Right. There's too much. And so because I think the science background, and also the science background, but also me having to sort of fight not against the scientists in my family, my father, of course, would be like, this is idiotic. And, they're all like, this is idiotic. I remember when my mother was dying, and my psychic Sophie had said, I think I just told you this, that I should be aware that her mother and her grandfather were going to be there waiting, and that would comfort her. And what Sophie had also said is that there will be moments when my mother doesn't see them there, and she'll get very frightened and feel very alone, and you have to comfort her, right? And I remember sitting with my brother, who was like, obviously, not obviously, but he, this was all BS. But my mother had been talking about her grandmother and her father being there. I mean, sorry, her mother and father, my grandmother, grandfather. And so my brother was like really intrigued, like, oh my God, she really sees them. And then he asked my mother, do you see Auntie whoever who also died? And my mother looked at him and was like, no, don't be so silly. She's dead. But to her, those other people weren't. And it was an awakening for him in a way. He certainly didn't turn to a very spiritual side. But when you see these things, you realize, yeah, they're there. I mean, there's so many signs all the time. And it's interesting when I used to teach a class, and I sometimes will still get to teach it. It's called Science in the Media. And it's the whole idea is we're not teaching science from your standard textbook, right? You can learn about science in the newspaper and read articles and, all kinds of documentaries. And so we look at science of viruses and, some more normal things, but we always end up on the science than paranormal. And when we start the discussion, most students don't want to really talk, maybe feel like they might have had an experience, or they know somebody that's had an experience, but they're a little bit shy and ashamed almost to talk about it. But after they feel like it's a safer environment and I share some of whatever I share, it almost always ends up that everyone has a story to share, whether they've experienced something or somebody they're close to has experienced something that is somewhat paranormal, whether it's a dream or a weird number or something coming up on your cell phone. I mean, they've almost all experienced it, and we're just not really allowed to talk about that yet. In a way, it's not dissimilar from the whole mental illness journey that we're not allowed to talk about. So I'm here to talk about, all these journeys you're not supposed to talk about. So I'm pretty open with my students about these things because I know that, I don't want them to feel ashamed of either their spirituality or their religion, whatever it is, and, whatever, struggles they're going, whatever struggles are going on
Sure.
emotionally with them.
Out of curiosity, did your grandmother's sister ever come through in any of the readings?
Yes, she did.
And what was
Yes.
her main thing, just to say there?
No, she didn't really. I wouldn't say that she necessarily came through clearly with a message, but it was more, there's a woman here who died during this time period who was connected to your grandmother, sending her love. A lot of, but I've had some amazing readings with psychics.
And I know you're going to be doing a future book about that, and I know I'll be speaking to you again about that. That's fascinating, that is.
I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the mental health illness as well. I mean, not that I know much about mental health illness, but we live in a time right now where anyone that was suffering with mental health illness, for some of us, it's only been amplified with isolation and all sorts of issues that have pushed them over the edge for some people, right? I don't think as a society we talk about mental health issues enough. Do you?
No, we're better for sure. But it's interesting because right now there are students, some of my students, the ones who maybe were excelling in the non-pandemic time are really struggling. And it's funny because, and we have grade school counselors, but even still it's whispered about, I have to talk, all right, it shouldn't be anything we're ashamed of here. But yeah, there's still this feeling. It's so interesting. It's just still this feeling of a certain weakness, that either the students or the kids or the family still feels there's a certain weakness. And it's really interesting because that desire, there's always been this desire to be perfect and healthy. And I think what's interesting is that's anchored in our minds through public discourse, not through, like somehow we've always told each other that. And I don't know, we have to get past that, and we really have to see
Don't you think
each
it's
other
also
all.
what your story is all about as well? Is that the patterns of the past, are the ways that still intergenerations, genetic, as you said as well, which I'm sure there is something in that as well,
Right.
and maybe from a soul lineage as well. Maybe that you've done this before in so many other ways that you're coming to repeat the same patterns because it's something that you need to sort out, right? Or it's the one,
Right. Oh, I believe that.
yeah, right, right.
Uh,
So I think there's a lot of pressure from parents sometimes who do their best, but also don't want to, see that maybe their son or daughter has mental health issues, would be embarrassed to even
Right.
talk about it or admit it. Everything's perfect here. I don't know what you're looking at. To go next door. Check them out. They've got problems. But we're fine. And it gets covered up and. Or then you've got the drugs on top of that, which maybe has come into the person's life who's got issues, and that again is just masquerading the issues and amplifying the
Right.
problem, right?
Right.
Not
Right.
making it any better. I mean, these are big subjects,
Right.
aren't they? Yeah.
Right. They're huge. And of course that happens all the time. I mean, that's how, oh, you not you self medicate, right? I mean, people do it all the time. They have this anxiety or depression or whatever they have, and you know, let's drink it. We can have some alcohol or whatever else is available, and it makes you feel better, maybe temporarily. It's certainly
I
understandable.
know, but for some people with mental health issues, um, I don't think they know they've got them. I don't think
Right.
there's something deep within them doesn't want to admit their issues because it's
Right.
genetic. But even that would, it's like even if you held a mirror up to them, they wouldn't want to know. Do you think that deep self analysis, that deep help, can only happen if the person wants to change? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's right. I remember you just reminded me of this crazy story when I was in McLean. And I remember I was whining to some nurse who was this wonderful, amazing nurse. And I was like, why can't I just be an alcoholic? If I was an alcoholic, then all I'd have to do is quit drinking. And I remember, I was only in my 20s. It's stupid. But I remember him looking at me and he was like, no, you have no idea. First, they have to quit drinking, which is incredibly hard. And then they have to deal with everything you're dealing with now. So, then, right, you just create more layers, things that you then break through. So,
I think if someone is suffering from any sort of mental health issues, whatever it may be, right, on the whole spectrum, it's you can point it out to the cows, to whatever extreme, right? And I just think if they're not ready to hear it, they're not going to hear it.
no, they're not. Right. No, I don't think you
What was
can.
your trigger moment to say shit? I get it. What was that trigger moment to say, oh my god, I'm seeing myself right now, and only I can change it. What was that moment? Do you remember?
Oh, God, that's a great question. I don't know that there was one moment. Um, I think that it definitely happened after my first daughter was born, and I think that the that my illness was so severe, that there was no more pretending. Like there was no more just, okay, I can pull it together and pretend to be fine. There was no more of that. And once I landed in a mental hospital, that really saved me because then I didn't finally, I'm like, okay, I'm in a mental hospital. I'm here for a reason. Like I didn't deny that piece. So that was when I was like, okay, try and figure out what the hell is going on. And I had an amazing psychiatrist who really sort of quote unquote reparented me. I know that sounds cheesy, but I did actual real psychoanalysis, which isn't done anymore. I mean, I went to therapy 5 days a week. I think about that. I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy. But I did for years.
And
so,
yeah. And now, yeah, well, it's like they say, isn't it? Unless you've ever, most people have considered, dying, or even like, I want out of this, I want to take my own life, kind of thing. And I think, you're only human to have those thoughts. Do you know what I mean? Because it can be difficult having this experience, can't it? But it's transforming that into seeing the opportunity that you've got now, isn't it? And being grateful for everything. But I'm sure, sometimes we need medication, don't we? But really,
right.
the only person that can save us is ourselves. That's what we forget
Right.
sometimes, don't we? And
yeah.
yeah, it's yeah. I don't have any answers. I'm just talking to you. Do you know what I mean? But you know,
well, you know what? And that's a beautiful thing. Which is not to have all the answers. And that's another thing. I try to teach my students. And one of the things I tell them is only a closed mind is certain, right? So your confusion and your uncertainty are wonderful things because they mean you're going to be open and they mean you're going to learn. Like you can't learn unless you're confused. You can't get to a further spot on your path or whatever unless you're uncertain and open to learn new things. So, of course we don't know, but that's the kind of the beauty of it. That's why I love all the paranormal stuff. Like, I don't know, but I know that when I cross to the other side, I'm going to know, at least when I'm on the other side for that time, I'm going to understand it all. And then I'll have to come back and live different lessons. But
what if all that we thought we knew about this so-called other side was so much greater than we'd ever imagined, and all we actually know was just something like it's all we know is like a single grain of sand on an infinite beach of just how big it really is, just what the nature of all this is. But you know what, that kind of thinking only brings me more back into present moment, that being here right now. Yes, there may be something greater. Yes, understanding that allows me to maybe live this greater version of myself, because I know that there's so much power there within me, that I can pull from. But it's still about being here now.
Right. I mean, I think understanding that or having a sense of that vastness can actually ground you more in the moment, and so that you can really appreciate, like, all right, I'm going to appreciate every second I can of these moments.
Because we maybe chose to come here. If that's the case, that there might have been this might be really important in ways that we're like, oh, I want out. But what if when you're elsewhere, you want in. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So, just to remember that sometimes, that if it's all an illusion, then let's enjoy that. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's just a game. It's just a game. Yeah. Right. But it feels very real. Yeah, and I suppose if we're living with those with mental health issues as well, that can be very difficult.
Right.
And yeah, I'm sure there is couples and other sorts of relationships where people do experience that on a daily basis.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
I mean, how are they, how do they cope with that? That is difficult, isn't it? Yeah.
But I do think there's help. I mean, there's help on, I think obviously medicine. There's a lot that we've learned, from medicine, from different therapies, and from the spiritual. I mean, Yeah, I would say like with my daughters, especially my oldest daughter, she went through, she was a, she was a, she was a character for sure. And, but there were some wild times and maybe some drugs, and then there was depression. I mean, I attacked it as a mother from all sides. Like I would drag her to see Sophie, the psychic, and drag her to the therapist for the therapy, and then the psychiatrist to look at medication. So, like, you know, maybe I overdid it. Like I said, mothers, I think all mothers try their best. I tried my best, but I was like, I'm going at this from all angles. I'm going in to help her in whatever way I can.
Yeah, I'm sure she looks back on that and it's made her who she
Right,
is. Do you know what I mean? I believe this, no matter what she's gone through or we've gone through, there are no mistakes. There are just experiences.
right, right. There are lessons. It's all, that's all,
What did you get out of that
that's
experience?
what we're,
Can you see the
yeah,
positive in it? And I think that's a good closing
right,
message right now as well, because obviously
right,
we've been on here quite a while, and I really do appreciate you
right.
coming on. I know this is about a non-fiction book, but it brings up all these sort of deeper issues as well that you've sort of touched upon within the book as well.
Right. I hope so. Yeah, I hope it has a final message, certainly of hope and redemption.
Okay, well, you maybe have said it there, but what is the most important message of the book again, one more time?
Well, I think the most important message is to learn to listen to each other and learn to understand where we're all coming from. And in that way, that kind of openness does bring love.
Yeah, and that's what it's all about, isn't it? Self-love and love for
And that
others.
is what it's all about.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. It is.
absolutely. Do you have a website for this?
I do. SylviaTrue.com.
Right. Okay. Well, that's been coming up on the lower third throughout this interview, but for the podcast version, yes, that's where you'll find more about yourself and also any future work you're going to do, and people can connect with you on that website as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love to connect with anybody.
Okay.
Really.
Well, Sylvia True, I just want to say thank you for giving us an hour of your time right now, and I wish you all the best
Thank
for the
you.
book. The book is out for a pre-order right now. It comes out, it's available in February. Links are in the description below for that as well. So until next time, Sophie. Sorry, until next time. I've got Sophie on the mind right now. And they've been,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, no, you know what? That was a great example of some sort of sign because Sophie died, and that was a sign that she's still here.
I'm sure absolutely she is, and she's probably very proud of you that you know what you've gone and done, and yeah, I'm sure she is, and well, yeah, from myself and Sophia, thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you.